Hello learners, welcome to our discussion on learning, that is a part of MS21, Social Processes and Behavioral Issues. In this session, we are going to discuss about the concept and definition of learning. We'll also talk about the theories of learning, and similarly, the last part of this discussion will be focusing on the reinforcement and learning. The process of learning has a great value for enriching the human life in all spheres. All activities and behaviors that make personal, social, and economic life peaceful and pleasurable are actually being learned. So learning affects the human behavior, especially in organizational setup. There is little organizational behavior that is not either directly or indirectly affected by learning. For example, say, a employee's skill or a manager's attitude, or if we see a supervisor's motivation. These are all being learned. Our ability to learn is very important to organizations which is preoccupied with controlled performance. So therefore, employees need to know what they are doing, how they are doing it, how well they are expected to do it, and so also the consequences of achieving something like a good or a poor level of performance. So therefore, learners, every action and behavior of an individual, as I said, it has something called as an element of learning. Behavior, when we see something publicly viewed, that is a behavior, but there is something called as a very unobservable inner cognitive behavior that influences actually an individual. Therefore, the outcome, it can take in the form of something called as a desirable behavior or an undesirable behavior. When people demonstrate the desirable behavior, basically that will help to achieve the organizational goal. Therefore, it is basically necessary on the part of every individual to learn how to demonstrate the desirable behavior, the new knowledge and skill. Further, the learning is also a very, when people learn, that stands to be as a powerful incentive, because that make them to stick to an organization. Learning has also have a very important or a very significant impact on behavior, because by the behavior itself that influences the ability of a person, okay, that molds the ability of a person, the role perception, the way we get motivated. So all it is influenced by learning. Therefore, learning actually is very important in terms of knowledge management, because it enhances our capacity to gain, to share, and to utilize the resources. The learning, especially when we are referring about learning organization, this got to be popular during 1990s. When we are referring to learning organization, it is a configuration of policies and structure that actually encourage individual learning. Okay, organization can be regarded over here having the capability to ensure that the members of the organization are able to learn. Okay, now let's talk about how to identify the cues of learning. Learning basically covers virtually any kind of behavior, and it is concerned something when you are acquiring the knowledge, acquiring the attitude, the values, okay, acquiring the responses, acquiring the skills, that's called as the motor skills. Okay, learning is defined also, it is something as a very, it is something as to be called as a permanent change in behavior. When you learn something, it changes our behavior. and behavior is demonstrated by experience. Okay, so the concept of learning, actually when you are referring to organizational behavior, it is having a very significant influence that we do. The concept of learning also happens in different contexts, because learning refers actually to the process of something when we acquire the response basing on to a situation which we have or have not previously encountered with. When we are referring so many things to build up the concept of learning, let's talk about what is the a simple definition of learning. The simple definition of learning is, it is something called as, when we learn, when we gain something, it influences our behavior. There is a change in our behavior, and that occurs as a result of our experience. Okay, therefore, as I say, learning equal to the relatively permanent change in behavior. Okay, so one cannot see the process of learning, but we can see a noticeable change when we demonstrate that learning in action, in the form of behavior. That means, actually, when we see the changed behavior in an individual, then you can see that there is some learning has taken place. Okay, therefore, learning as a concept, it is abstract and it is a theoretical one, and we cannot observe directly that how learning is taking place. But learning is always as I said, it is a permanent change in our behavior. Say, for example, in a work organizational setting, okay, the way the organization norms are there, okay, that actually the organizational norms that sets or creates a base for determining the employees what is being expected from them, what is desirable from them, what is not being desirable from them. Okay, so it is therefore learning is the process by which the people gain necessary skill, knowledge, attitude, and behavior. Okay, and they demonstrate it in an organization. Okay, that will drive them towards the desirable behavior itself, so that the organization can stand protected. Okay, people, actually, if you relate learning actually with employees or people, everybody, you, me, everybody, we learn at our own pace, we learn at different rates, at different points of time we learn. Say, now when you continue your a program for learning, you might have been, you have chosen a time which is very suitable for you, so that you can devote your time and efforts. So similarly, it varies also in different stages. Okay, so of course, ultimately, learning mean it is the individual's own needs and drives and rewards that enhances actually one's potential and expertise, right? So now when we refer about the components of learning, for example, learning basically involves change. Okay, the change may be for, when we learn something, it may change for a good, or it may change for something bad. And every kind of learning, actually, not all the changes reflect the learning, because when we say that learning has actually happened, that means the change that is taking place, it should remain with us for a long time. It should be relatively permanent. When we learn, learning gets reflected in our behavior, because a change in the process of our thought, process of our way we demonstrate, okay, if it is not accompanied by the behavior, then obviously we cannot say there is no learning. Okay, therefore, whatever you learn, it is not that just we put it in our brain, but rather we have to put it in our action. And any change in behavior need to result from experience, practice, or training. And learners, another point is, learning actually occurs throughout one's life. It is not that only learning happens for up to post graduation or MPhil or a PhD degree, but learning occurs throughout employee's life. Normally, you and me learn, and when employees learn like us, they acquire something called as explicit or a tacit knowledge. Explicit and tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge mean it is communicated from one person to the another one, and here in explicit knowledge, it can be, you can write it down and provide it to others, and majority of the people actually they apply the tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge mean that is a idea one knows more than what he or she can tell, because tacit knowledge is action oriented. Tacit knowledge is embedded actually in our action, the way we put our thoughts, but actually it is not clearly understood, therefore it cannot be communicated explicitly, because tacit knowledge is acquired through basically observation and through direct experience. So actually most of the knowledge whatever organization gets or organization has is tacit, and one of the challenge in the field of knowledge management is to make implicit knowledge, right, the tacit knowledge explicit, so that it can be stored and it can be shared. So this is about the the kinds of learning, the two kinds of learning. We have spoken about the explicit and tacit knowledge. Then comes the theories of learning. Okay, there are several theories, and primarily I would like to bring it to you that there are 4 theories of learning. One of the theories is called classical conditioning theory. Let's talk about it. That is the first theory. Classical conditioning theory talks about where an individual learn to link the information value from something called as a neutral stimulus, okay, which is actually the natural course will not cause a response. The learned behavior, which is called as a reflexive behavior, actually in the classical conditioning process, what it happens is a stimulus, okay, a stimulus which is an environmental stimulus or an unconditional stimulus will provide you something called as a natural response. Okay, then what it happens, then actually a conditioned stimulus, when you refer to it, talks about a neutral environment that associates the unconditional stimulus, and that brings out the behavior. This classical conditioning theory was explained by Ivan Pavlov, and he has experimented with the dogs. In this experiment, conditioned stimulus, actually he found that it was associated and paired with a conditioned response. Okay, when you place the food to the dog salivate. So the salivating response is a conditioned response. So the process of classical conditioning actually helps to understand a lot of things in an organizational life itself. So classical conditioning, again, learners, it is a passive one, because when something happens, actually we read in a particular way. Classical conditioning also is not used in many work settings because the desired employee behavior usually do not include responses which can be changed with the classical conditioning. Next one, the next theory is called as an operant conditioning theory. This theory was given by a man called B.F. Skinner. He said that the determination of a behavior happens from outside. That means any kind of behavior that happens in us is a learned and an involuntary behavior. Okay, operant conditioning actually is used in the conditions of voluntary behavior. Okay, the opposite of it, that is called as operants, because they have some kind of influence with the environment. Skinner says that if there is certain pleasant consequence or the pleasant results we get it, that means our behavior gets reinforced, and we try to put up a lot of frequency to have such behaviors. That means the people will be engaged in such kind of desirable behavior because that is positively being reinforced. Further, if there is something called as an undesirable behavior, okay, like when they find that there is something as an undesirable behavior which is punished, actually that people also stops reacting in the same way, right? So this is called as a operant conditioning theory. The third theory talks about the social cognitive theory. This theory was given by Albert Bandura. He says that people learn the new behavior when they are into a social situation. In the social situation, they watch others, they imitate them, and according to the social cognition theory, the social aspect actually indicates actually the involvement of the individual to be a part of the society. Okay, that is the social aspect of it. Whereas the cognitive aspect of it talks about acknowledging the people, using the thought process to make the decision. This theory has a great relevance to organizational behavior also. And the social cognitive theory has 5 dimensions. There are the 5 dimensions are in the form of something, the number 1 called as symbolizing. That means people used to have a tendency to use the symbols to process their visual experiences into models, and that actually guide them for the behavior and they react to the environment. So symbolizing. Second one talks about forethoughts. Forethoughts mean this is used by people to anticipate, to plan in advance so that they can guide their behavior and actions. So forethoughts. The third and important thing, vicarious learning. Vicarious learning talks about sharing imaginatively in the feeling of action of other persons. That means in vicarious learning, we observe the behavior of other people and the consequences that is linked to that behavior. Fourth one talks about self-control. Self-control happens when a new behavior is learned automatically when there was no such external pressures. So over here, in an organizational setup, managers or employees use self-efficacy because that helps the employees to learn to believe in themselves. And how it can be happening? It can happen by creating situations wherein the employee may respond successfully to the task. Here, trainers like human resource trainers, they use actually the social cognitive theory and they construct different programs and they offer it to the employees, because such programs of devising more in terms of the social cognitive theory itself used to instill something called as the leadership skills among people. It will improve self-efficacy of the individuals who are working, brings about effectiveness, and also it instills the team spirit. The last theory refers about the learning theory. Learning theory talks about the assessment of behavior, the assessment of the behavior in measurable or in a very objective way. I mean, behavior must be actually publicly observable and they should not give due, kind of importance to an unobservable or inner or a cognitive behavior. In an organizational setup, actually what we require the desirable work behavior, because this desirable work behavior drives an organization to achieve organizational goal. In retrospect, if there is undesirable work behavior, that will actually hinder the achievement of the goal. Therefore, the HR manager, for example, may find the behavior of a shop floor worker who is returning late from a tea break is actually as undesirable, while the friends of the worker may find the same behavior as desirable because the worker is satisfying the social need. So therefore, the more an employee deviates from the organizational norms, then the more the undesirable behavior he or she demonstrate. And these organizational norms actually will vary from organization to organization. For example, companies like Infosys, they encourage all the people to have open and two-way communication with their superiors, because they count the such professional interactions actually shut out the problems that is associated with the communication, and that stands to be more healthy. Therefore, to be effective, what it is required is, in one hand, when we foster a two-way communication among people, also a manager need to identify what are the observable employee behavior, and also need to understand in terms of how it is affecting, how the environment is affecting this behavior. Then only he can surely make efforts to control and guide the employee behavior. Therefore, on the parlance of learning, the goal of a manager is to provide learning experience in an environment, because those things only can promote employee behavior that is desired by the organization. Friends, the next thing talks about the reinforcement. There is another word that comes in learning, is reinforcement. Reinforcement is a psychological process, okay? The psychological process of motivation, okay? But there is a difference between motivation and reinforcement. When we say motivation, motivation actually is a fundamental psychological process. It's a very fundamental psychological process which talks about the need, drive, and incentive. Whereas reinforcement is a broader connotation. Motivation is a very intrinsic process, whereas when you are saying about reinforcement, it is related to an external environment. Reinforcement enhances the strength of the response, okay, and then it will promote the people whether should I repeat the behavior or not. Okay, if you get rewarded, it gets repeated. If it get punished, then obviously I should not repeat it. So let's talk about what are the contingency of reinforcement. What is contingency of reinforcement? Contingency of reinforcement talks about the relationship between a person's behavior and the proceedings following the environmental events. Contingency of reinforcement that comprises of an antecedent, a behavior, and a consequence. Okay, that means it should be noted that presenting or withdrawal of a particular antecedent, it increases the probability of a particular behavior. Okay, for example, manager in the morning meeting itself, what they are supposed to do, they should prepare a to-do list item every day. This list itself is an antecedent, because this to-do list will help him and his people to organize the job and task for the day, and that will also call attention on a specific behavior. Okay, this is about the antecedent. The consequences will be the result that he get it. The result may come either in the form of a positive accomplishment of the goal or a negative accomplishment of the goal. Okay, so reinforcement, and there are other two words like punishment or extinction. Reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. These three words actually they are the key role in learning process, because reinforcement is used when it enhances. When reinforcement is used, it enhances the desirable behavior. While when we punish people or when we kick people out, that is extinction. These are all employed to minimize the undesirable behavior. Okay, so reinforcement, therefore, learners, it is an attempt to develop or strengthen the desirable behavior. And therefore, when we talk about the types of reinforcement, there are two types of reinforcement. One is called as a positive reinforcement, and the other one is called as a negative reinforcement. When you do a positive reinforcement, that means it will strengthen and enhance the behavior. Okay, positive reinforcement actually is based on a set of principles. One is called as a principle of contingent reinforcement. This contingent reinforcement talks about that the reinforcer need to be admitted only if the desirable behavior has occurred. The principle of immediate reinforcement says that the reinforcer will be most effective if it is admitted or administered immediately. Once the desired behavior happens, then you immediately reinforce it. The principle of reinforcement size talks about that the larger the amount of reinforcement delivered after the desired behavior, we can see a more effect. The principle of reinforcement deprivation talks about another important point, that the more a person is deprived from the reinforcer, the greater the chance it will have a future occurrence of the desired behavior. This is about the positive reinforcement learners. When you refer about the negative reinforcement, the very meaning of negative reinforcement says about that there is an unpleasant event which is preceding a behavior and is removed when the desired behavior is occurring. Normally, we see this negative reinforcement in organizational life and so also in our personal life. Supervisors normally they apply the negative reinforcement. Okay, when they stop criticizing employees actually whose poor performance has improved. Negative reinforcement in our personal life, you will see it happens when parents give to their children the tantrums, especially in public places. Okay, so therefore, you know, the both, when you talk about the reinforcement, both the positive and negative reinforcement, actually they are the procedures or processes that strengthens or, you know, diminishes the behavior, the expected behavior. When we say positive reinforcement, that strengthens or increases the behavior by the presentation of desirable consequences. But whereas in the negative reinforcement, it strengthens and increases the behavior by the threat of or use of the undesirable consequences. Okay. Negative reinforcement is also sometimes, you know, it gets confused with punishment, because both of them, they use actually unpleasant stimuli, that is kind of a punishment, to influence the behavior. Therefore, friends, in this session, we spoke about three important things. One is about the concept and definition of learning. Second one, we referred about the importance of the learning in this way, and we have identified the cues of the learning. We spoke about the different components of learning, and also in that context, we have differentiated about the explicit and implicit knowledge. Then you spoke about the theories of learning, and there are four theories of learning. There is a classical conditioning, operant conditioning, social cognitive theory, and the learning theory. Finally, we spoke about the reinforcement and learning, and we focused that what is the importance, what is the contingency of reinforcement, and what are the positive and negative reinforcement. This is all about, you know, the first part of reaching to learning. Thank you so much, friends.